What if the silence wasn't empty? What if every moment you thought you were being ignored was actually a moment you were being measured? There's something in quantum physics that most people never hear about. Particles behave one way when no one is watching, but the moment they are observed, they change. Completely, not gradually, instantly. The act of observation alters reality. Now ask yourself something. During the period when everything felt still, when no one responded the way you expected, when the world seemed quiet around you, did you break or did you hold your ground? Because if you held your ground, if you stayed silent instead of reacting, if you chose stability over chaos, then something already shifted and you didn't even see it happen. In quantum mechanics, once observation confirms strength, the wave collapses. And once collapse happens, the system has no choice but to respond. You weren't ignored, you were being observed. And now, the response phase has begun. 1. Observation changes behavior. In quantum physics, there is something deeply unsettling. A particle does not behave the same way when it is being watched. Before observation, it exists in possibility. After observation, it becomes fixed. This is not philosophy. This is experiment. In the famous double-slit experiment, particles move like waves when unobserved. They spread, they remain open, they behave as pure potential. But the moment a detector is placed to watch them, they change. They act like solid particles. They choose a path. They collapse into certainty. Nothing about the particle itself changes, only the fact that it is being observed. Let that sink in. The act of being watched alters reality. Now think about your life. There was a period when you felt ignored. No reaction, no validation, no response. You assumed nothing was happening. But what if that silence wasn't absence? What if it was measurement? What if your stability was being tested under observation? You see, before observation, a system remains unstable. It contains multiple possibilities. You could react, you could break, you could chase, you could explode emotionally. All those versions of you existed as potential, but then something happened. You didn't react, you didn't chase, you didn't beg for clarity, you held your position. And in that moment, the superposition of your identity collapsed. You became definite, you became stable, and just like the particle in the experiment, your behavior changed because of observation. Here's the deeper truth most people never realize. Observation doesn't just measure you. It forces you to reveal who you really are. When pressure is applied and someone watches how you handle it, your internal structure becomes visible. Weak structures crack. Coherent structures hold. In physics, coherence means alignment. Stability, internal agreement. In life, it means something similar. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions align under pressure, you become coherent. And coherent systems are powerful because coherence reduces chaos. When you refuse to react impulsively, you reduced chaos. When you stayed grounded while being evaluated, you increased coherence. And coherence attracts structural change. The world responds differently to someone who is unstable versus someone who is solid. You might not have seen the shift immediately, but the moment you stopped performing for attention, the moment you stopped reacting emotionally, the moment you held your ground quietly, you collapsed into a new version of yourself. And once that collapse happens, there is no going back to the old uncertainty. This is why everything feels subtly different now, because you are no longer potential. You are decided. You are no longer reacting. You are observing. And when you move from being reactive to being stable under observation, you change your position in the system. In physics, that changes outcomes. In life, it changes how reality interacts with you. You thought you were ignored, but the truth is more powerful than that. You were being watched. And when the observation revealed strength instead of instability, the entire equation changed. 2. The silence was data collection. In quantum physics, nothing reacts randomly. When a system appears quiet, inactive, still, it is not idle. It is calculating. In many quantum experiments, the result you see on the screen is not the moment the event truly happened. There is always an invisible process between interaction and outcome. Information is gathered. Conditions are assessed. Probabilities are recalculated. And during that invisible window, everything is being measured, but nothing looks like it's moving. That delay is not emptiness, it's processing. Now think about the period in your life when everything felt paused. No messages, No validation, no breakthrough, no obvious response from the world. You interpreted that silence as rejection. But what if it was a recalibration phase? What if your behavior was being recorded? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't respond instantly to unstable input. They wait. They gather data. They measure patterns. When you reacted emotionally in the past, the system labeled you reactive, predictable, easy to destabilize. But then something changed. You stopped reacting. You stopped chasing. You stopped trying to force a response. And when that happened, something far more powerful began. Data collection. Your silence became information. Your restraint became information. Your composure became information. The system had to reassess you. In physics, when new data enters a system, the probability distribution shifts. Old predictions become invalid. New outcomes become possible. That's what happened to you. You changed your behavioral pattern. And when a pattern changes, every model built around that pattern must update. Think about that carefully. If someone expects you to explode and you remain calm, their internal prediction collapses. If someone expects you to chase and you withdraw, their mental model fails. And when predictions fail, systems recalibrate. That recalibration feels like silence. But it's not. It's adjustment. You weren't being ignored. You were being remeasured. There is another layer to this. In quantum theory, the more precisely something is measured, the less uncertainty remains. Precision reduces ambiguity. When you held your ground consistently, day after day, without reaction, you reduced uncertainty about who you are. You became measurable, predictable in strength, unpredictable in reaction, and that combination is destabilizing to old dynamics. People respond quickly to chaos, but they respond slowly and carefully to stability, because stability forces strategy. When you became steady, those around you had to slow down and think. And thinking takes time, so what you experienced as delay was actually strategic recalculation. You were not dismissed. You were being evaluated more seriously than before. Silence is what happens when a system is deciding how to respond to a new version of you. And here is the key truth. When you change your behavior, you don't get an instant reward. You get observation, then recalculation, then response. That order never changes. Most people break during the recalculation phase because they misinterpret silence as failure. You didn't. You stayed consistent. And consistency under silence is power, because once the data confirms your stability, the system cannot go back to treating you the same way. The response that follows is different, more cautious, more deliberate, more aligned with your new position. You thought nothing was happening, but something was. Every calm decision, every restrained reaction, every moment you chose control over chaos, was rewriting the probabilities around you. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was analysis, and analysis always precedes adjustment. 3. The observer effect is real. There is a principle in quantum physics that unsettles even scientists. It's called the observer effect. It states that the very act of measuring something changes its behavior, not slightly, fundamentally. A particle behaves differently when it knows it's being observed. The system shifts, the outcome adjusts. The presence of awareness alters the result. Now understand what that implies. Observation is not passive. It is active influence. When something is watching, it participates. Now think about your life. Have you ever felt that pressure? That invisible weight when you knew someone was evaluating you? When you felt watched, judged, tested, you behaved differently, more careful, more guarded, more precise. But here's the deeper layer most people never reach. What happens when you stop reacting under observation? Most people perform when watched. They over-explain, they defend, they try to control the narrative. They panic under scrutiny. That's predictable behavior. And predictable systems are easy to manipulate. But when you stopped performing, when you refused to defend yourself unnecessarily, when you stopped trying to prove your value, the entire dynamic shifted. Because now the observer no longer had control over your reaction. And in any system, control over reaction equals power. The observer effect works both ways. Yes, being watched changes behavior. But when you refuse to change under observation, you reverse the power structure. You become the stable variable, and the one watching becomes uncertain. Uncertainty destabilizes control. This is why silence under scrutiny is so powerful. If someone expects you to react and you don't, their mental model breaks. If someone expects you to explain and you don't, they are forced to think. If someone expects you to collapse under pressure and you remain composed, they begin to question their position. In physics, when an expected pattern fails, the theory must be adjusted. In life, when an expected reaction fails, the dynamic must be restructured. You didn't just stay silent, you disrupted expectation. And disruption creates instability in the observer. That's when everything shifts. There's another layer. When you constantly react emotionally, you give observers information about how to influence you. Your triggers become visible. Your insecurities become accessible. Your boundaries become negotiable. But when you regulate yourself, when you respond instead of react, when you hold emotional control even under scrutiny, you remove leverage. And when leverage disappears, respect recalibrates. You may not have noticed it in the moment, but the moment you stopped feeding reactions into the system lost predictive power over you, and predictive power is the foundation of control. Now imagine how unsettling that is for someone who thought they understood you. They watch, they expect, they anticipate, and nothing happens. No emotional spike, no defensive energy, no chaotic response. Just calm, just stability, just presence. That's not weakness, that's structural strength. And strong structures don't bend under observation, they remain constant. In physics, constant variables define the system. In life, constant composure defines authority. The observer effect reveals something powerful. Awareness influences reality, but controlled awareness reshapes power. You weren't ignored, you were observed. And when the observation failed to destabilize you, the equation changed. Because the one who cannot be shaken under scrutiny becomes the one the system must now adjust to. 4. Nothing is isolated. Quantum entanglement. One of the most disturbing discoveries in quantum physics is this. Two particles can become connected in such a way that no matter how far apart they are, they still affect each other instantly. This is called quantum entanglement. Distance does not weaken the connection. Time does not slow the effect. A change in one produces an immediate change in the other. Scientists struggled with this for decades because it breaks classical logic. It suggests that separation is not as real as we think it is. Now, let's bring this into your life. You believed your shift happened privately. You thought your internal growth was invisible. You assumed that, because you didn't announce your transformation, no one felt it. But if entanglement is real at the fundamental level of reality, then influence does not require proximity. When you change internally, the system connected to you adjusts. When you detach emotionally, the energetic pattern shifts. When you withdraw attention, something feels the absence. You may not see it immediately, but the effect is there. Think about this carefully. Have you ever sensed when someone pulled away from you, even before they said anything? Have you ever felt a shift in someone's energy without explanation? That is entanglement in human form. We are not isolated systems. We are interacting fields. And when two people share history, emotion, tension, or attachment, a form of entanglement exists. So when you stabilized yourself, when you stopped reacting, when you emotionally detached from chaos, that change did not stay confined inside you. It transmitted, because entangled systems do not allow one side to change without consequence on the other. You didn't need to send a message. You didn't need to make an announcement. You didn't need to prove anything. The shift was felt. That's why behavior around you started changing subtly. That's why dynamics felt different. That's why certain people became restless. Because when you shift internally, old alignments no longer match. In physics, when one particle changes spin, the other adjusts instantly to maintain balance. In life, when you raise your emotional stability, unstable dynamics begin to strain. The old pattern tries to reassert itself. But if you remain firm, if you do not fall back into old reactions, the connection recalibrates, or it collapses. This is why growth can feel lonely, because when you change your internal frequency, not everything connected to your old state can survive. Entanglement ensures that your transformation has consequences. You cannot grow without creating ripple effects. And here is the powerful truth most people overlook. You do not need to chase someone for them to feel your absence. You do not need to argue for them to sense your boundary. You do not need to announce your detachment for it to register. When the connection was real, the shift is real. And shifts do not go unnoticed in entangled systems. You weren't ignored. You weren't forgotten. You weren't irrelevant. Your transformation triggered a recalibration in everything connected to you. The reason it felt quiet afterward is because systems take time to reorganize after a structural change. But reorganization always follows disturbance. And your growth was a disturbance. The moment you stopped feeding old energy into the connection, the moment you stabilized your side, the entire dynamic had to respond, because nothing in this universe operates in isolation. And when one node in the system strengthens, the entire network feels it. That is entanglement, that is influence, that is why your shift mattered more than you realized. 5. Collapse happens after certainty. In quantum physics, nothing becomes real until it collapses. Before collapse, a particle exists in multiple states at once. It is not one thing, it is probability, it is uncertainty, it is potential. But the moment measurement occurs, the wave function collapses. Possibility becomes fact. Uncertainty becomes decision. Multiple futures become one path. This is not metaphor. It is the mathematical backbone of quantum mechanics. Now look at your life through that lens. For a long time, you existed in emotional superposition. You could react, you could walk away, you could fight, you could forgive, you could chase, you could detach. All of those versions of you existed at the same time. You were uncertain, and uncertainty keeps systems suspended. As long as you were undecided, everything around you remained undecided too. Relationships stayed unclear, outcomes stayed delayed, respect stayed unstable, opportunities hovered but didn't land, because the system could not collapse while you were still fluctuating. But then something changed. You became certain, not loud, not dramatic, certain. You stopped negotiating your worth internally. You stopped debating whether you should tolerate what drained you. You stopped oscillating between hope and self-doubt. And in that moment, the wave collapsed. In physics, collapse is irreversible. Once the state becomes definite, it cannot return to pure probability without new external interference. That's what happened to you. You became definite, and definiteness forces reality to reorganize. Most people never reach this stage because they fear certainty. Certainty feels risky. When you become certain, you eliminate fallback options. You remove ambiguity. You choose. And choice is powerful because it stabilizes identity. When you stabilized internally, old dynamics could no longer float in ambiguity. People who relied on your indecision lost leverage. Situations that survived on your hesitation lost structure. Because hesitation feeds instability, certainty feeds collapse. There is something else most people don't understand about collapse in quantum systems. It requires coherence. If a system is too chaotic, collapse cannot stabilize into a clean state. But if a system becomes internally aligned, collapse happens sharply. You aligned your thoughts, you aligned your standards, you aligned your boundaries, and that alignment created coherence. Coherence creates decisive outcomes. You might not have seen fireworks, you might not have heard an announcement, but collapse is often silent. It happens beneath the surface first. Old timelines close quietly, old perceptions fade subtly, old access points disappear without warning, because once the system recognizes your certainty, it stops offering you the same outcomes. Think about this deeply. When someone is unsure about leaving, they are treated one way. When someone is certain they can leave, they are treated differently. When someone is unsure about their value, they are negotiated with. When someone is certain of their value, they are respected. Certainty shifts power, and power shifts response. You weren't ignored during that silent phase. You were stabilizing, and once stabilization completed, collapse followed. Now here is the part most people miss. Collapse doesn't just change external outcomes, It rewrites internal identity. You cannot go back to being the person who tolerated what you've outgrown. You cannot unknow your worth once it has solidified. You cannot re-enter a dynamic as the old version of yourself, because the wave has collapsed. The identity has chosen. The state has become definite. That's why things feel different now, not because something magical happened, but because you stopped wavering. And in quantum systems, wavering delays resolution. Certainty forces it. You may still be waiting to see visible proof. But understand this: when collapse happens internally, external reality follows. There is always a lag between structural shift and visible manifestation. But the direction is already locked, because collapse is not suggestion, it is decision. You decided, silently, calmly, without spectacle, and that decision changed the field around you. You weren't ignored, you were in superposition. And the moment you became certain, reality had no choice but to collapse around that certainty. 6. Silence is high-level control. In physics, noise is distortion. When a system is noisy, measurements become unclear, data becomes unreliable, outcomes fluctuate, the signal gets buried in interference. But when a system becomes quiet, when external disturbance reduces, precision increases, clarity sharpens, control stabilizes. In quantum experiments, researchers go to extreme lengths to eliminate noise. They isolate systems from vibration, from temperature shifts, from electromagnetic disturbance, because even the smallest interference can change results. Now understand what that means in your life. Emotional reactivity is noise. Over-explaining is noise. Defending yourself repeatedly is noise. Chasing validation is noise. Arguing endlessly is noise. Noise makes you predictable. Noise makes you readable. Noise makes you measurable in ways that give others leverage. When you react loudly, you reveal where you are vulnerable. When you argue defensively, you show what unsettles you. When you chase clarity from someone who withdraws, you show where your center depends on them. Noise exposes instability, but when you went silent, when you stopped feeding arguments, when you stopped explaining your boundaries, when you stopped reacting to provocation, you remove distortion from the system, and when distortion disappears, power shifts. Silence is not absence of strength, it is controlled strength. There is a difference between silence from fear and silence from control. Fear-based silence feels tense, suppressed, fragile. Controlled silence feels steady, calm, unmoved. When you chose not to react, it wasn't because you had nothing to say. It was because you realized saying less gave you more power. In physics, when a variable stops fluctuating wildly, the entire system becomes more stable. Stability increases influence. The most dangerous person in any dynamic is not the loudest. It is the most controlled, because control cannot be manipulated easily. When you became quiet, something subtle happened. The system lost access to your emotional triggers, and when someone loses access to your triggers, they lose access to controlling you. Think about how many dynamics survive purely on reaction. Provocation followed by emotional response, withdrawal followed by chasing, disrespect followed by defense. It's a cycle built on noise, but silence interrupts cycles. Silence forces the other side to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty destabilizes those who rely on reaction. When you didn't react the way you used to, people around you felt it. They tested again. You stayed calm. They pushed again. You stayed measured. At some point, they realized the old buttons no longer worked. That realization is destabilizing, because if they can't predict your reaction, they can't steer the outcome. In high-level systems, unpredictability combined with stability creates authority. You became unpredictable in your reactions, but predictable in your composure. That combination is powerful. There is another layer to this. Silence increases observation. When you are quiet, you see more. When you are not defending yourself, you notice patterns. When you are not reacting emotionally, you detect inconsistencies. Silence sharpens awareness, and awareness increases strategic advantage. In quantum systems, reduced noise increases coherence. Coherence means internal alignment. When your thoughts, emotions, and behavior align, you emit stability. And stable systems reshape unstable environments. That's why, after your silence, things began shifting. Not loudly, but subtly. People changed tone, dynamics softened, Some individuals withdrew entirely, because silence under pressure signals confidence, and confidence without noise commands respect. You didn't need to announce your shift. You demonstrated it, without spectacle, without argument, without proving anything. And here is the final truth about silence. It forces others to fill the space. When you stop over-explaining, others start questioning. When you stop reacting, others start analyzing. When you stop chasing, others start reconsidering. Silence transfers psychological weight. The person who needs the reaction now carries the discomfort, and discomfort leads to recalibration. You weren't ignored in your quiet phase. You were consolidating control. You were removing interference. You were strengthening coherence. And once coherence stabilizes, response from the external world becomes inevitable. Because controlled systems influence chaotic ones, not the other way around. You thought you were doing nothing, but in reality, you were doing something extremely rare. You were mastering stillness, and stillness is the highest form of control in any dynamic. That's why everything feels different now, because when you stopped reacting, you started commanding. 7. After observation comes response. There is a sequence in quantum mechanics that never changes. First, there is possibility, then there is observation, then there is collapse, and finally, there is outcome. Most people obsess over the outcome. They want visible proof. They want immediate validation. They want confirmation that something shifted. But in every quantum system, the outcome is the last step, not the first. Before anything becomes visible, it is measured. Before it is measured, it exists as probability. Before probability collapses, there is uncertainty. And uncertainty can feel unbearable if you don't understand what stage you're in. You thought the silence meant rejection. You thought the delay meant failure. You thought the lack of visible reaction meant nothing changed. But you were between observation and response. That phase is invisible, and invisible phases test the strongest minds. In physics, when a system is observed and stabilizes into a definite state, it must produce a measurable result. It cannot remain suspended forever. Once collapse occurs, the system reorganizes around the new certainty. That reorganization may not be loud, but it is inevitable. When you stabilized yourself, when you refused to react impulsively, when you became internally certain, when you removed emotional noise, you completed the collapse. Now the system must respond. Here's what most people don't realize. Response doesn't always come as reward. Sometimes it comes as removal. Sometimes it comes as distance. Sometimes it comes as doors closing. Sometimes it comes as unexpected opportunity. But response always matches the version of you that stabilized. If you collapsed into strength, the response aligns with strength. If you collapsed into self-respect, the response aligns with self-respect. If you collapsed into detachment, the response aligns with detachment. Reality reorganizes around coherence, and coherence is powerful because it reduces contradiction. When you were uncertain, your external world mirrored uncertainty, mixed signals, unclear outcomes, unstable dynamics. But when you became certain internally, contradiction could not survive around you. Systems that do not match your frequency either upgrade or exit. That's not mysticism, that's structural alignment. In physics, once a state becomes definite, probabilities adjust around that new state. Old paths are no longer viable. New paths become dominant. You may still be waiting for proof, but understand this carefully. Once collapse happens, the direction is locked. The manifestation of that direction can take time, but the path is no longer random. You are no longer floating between outcomes. You are moving toward one. There is something else deeply important here. After observation, the system does not respond emotionally. It responds mathematically. It responds based on stability, based on coherence, based on probability alignment. That means your calm mattered more than your words. Your restraint mattered more than your arguments. Your silence mattered more than your explanations, because behavior under observation reveals structure, and structure determines response. Think about a bridge being stress tested. If it holds under pressure, traffic increases. If it cracks, traffic stops. The stress test is not punishment, it's evaluation. You passed evaluation by remaining stable. Now, load increases, responsibility increases, opportunity increases, or distance increases from what cannot handle your new weight. That is response, and response is inevitable. Most people sabotage themselves in this stage. They become impatient, they break their certainty, they reintroduce noise, they second-guess their decision. And when uncertainty returns, collapse destabilizes. But you didn't. You stayed steady. You held the line. And because of that, the outcome is already forming. You may not see it yet, but you can feel something shifting, a subtle rearrangement, a different tone in conversations, a different kind of attention, a different kind of silence. That's the system recalibrating. When a quantum system collapses, it emits information. When you collapsed into certainty, you emitted clarity. Clarity forces reorganization. You weren't ignored. You weren't overlooked. You weren't dismissed. You were evaluated. And once evaluation confirmed strength instead of fragility, the response phase began. Here is the final truth. Response does not beg. Response does not chase. Response aligns. It aligns you with what matches your new structure. It removes what no longer fits. It upgrades what can rise with you. And it distances what cannot survive your coherence. You cannot collapse into certainty and expect the old world to remain unchanged. It won't, because uncertainty was the glue holding unstable dynamics together. Certainty dissolves that glue. So if things feel different now, if certain energies feel distant, if certain opportunities feel closer, if certain people seem unsettled, that is not coincidence. That is response. After observation comes outcome. And your outcome is already unfolding, not because you forced it, not because you demanded it, but because you stabilized. And in any system, quantum or human stability under observation is the rarest and most powerful state. You weren't ignored, you were being observed, you stabilized, the wave collapsed, the noise disappeared, the entanglement shifted, the certainty locked in. Now the response is inevitable, and it will match exactly who you chose to become. So if the silence felt heavy, if the delay felt confusing, if the distance made you question everything, understand this: observation always comes before response. You were being measured in moments you thought were meaningless. Your restraint was recorded. Your composure was noted. Your certainty stabilized the field around you. And once a system confirms stability, it reorganizes. Quietly, precisely, inevitably. You don't need to chase what's aligning. You don't need to force what's recalibrating. You don't need to explain who you've become, because once collapse happens, the direction is already locked. You weren't ignored. You were being observed. And now the only thing left is the response. Stay steady. It's already moving.